In this episode of Derp, I've added nautical mines to the Oceanus dimension that explode and deal damage to both the player and enemies. I'll start by making a new inherited scene from the Bumpership base class, and I'll add a sprite, rename it to base sprite, and apply the naval mine texture. And I'll add a collision shape, set it to circle, and I'll move the sprite down so the circle is centered, and then I'll increase the size of the collision shape, and I'll give it 1 health and 10 points. Then in the Oceanus default biome, right, I'll save the mine first, and then I can add it to the default biome. So I'll append it to the bumper list. And in main, load the second dimension. I'll rename the collision shape so that it can find the node. So now, as you can see, the mines do spawn and are destroyed when they take damage from the player. Since the mine actually deals damage, I want to differentiate from the spaceship explosion, so I'll use a particle emitter instead of the static GIF. I did find a very helpful tutorial which I used as reference, and I'll put a link in the description if you want more information. So I'll set the spark particle texture and set the process material to a new particles material and turn the gravity to 0. I'll set the initial velocity up to 400 and randomize that. Then turn the spread up all the way under direction to make it radiate out from the center. Then I'll set the color ramp to a new gradient. From yellow to red. And we want it to fade a bit, so I'll add the transparent colors at both ends. Also increase the scale, randomize the initial angle, and the angular velocity to make it a bit more realistic. Then I'll turn up the damping to 500 so they stay close to the initial point, and turn the explosiveness up a bit to make them explode all at once. And I'll turn the amount up to 50 and the lifetime random all the way up to give it some variation. Now that I have it to scale, I'll save it as a new scene, save branches scene, and remove it from the mine. Then I'll add a new area 2D. And make this the scene root. Then add a collision shape, circle 2D, and make this roughly the size of the explosion. And attach a new script to the node. I'll set the damage to 100 and the faction to environment so it can deal damage to both the player and the enemies. Then I only want to deal damage once, so on ready, for body, in get overlapping bodies, I'll use the connector to deal damage from the explosion to the body and the amount. Now I'll set the particle emitter to only play once, so enable one shot, and there's no signal for when the emitter is done playing, so I'll add a timer and set it to 2 seconds, enable auto start, and on timeout I'll queue free to clean up the node. Then in the naval mine bumper, I'll detach the base script and make a new one, extending bumper ship. Then I'll override the explode function. So var explode equals load, get the scene, and make a new instance, set the explosion transform equal to the global transform, then use the connector to draw the explosion. I also need to reset the starting health and points since I changed the script, and in the explosion on ready, I'll set the particle emitting equal to true so it actually starts to play. Now if I remove the sharks from the ocean dimension just for testing, you can see that the mines do explode and create an area. However, they're not dealing any damage. That's because get overlapping bodies doesn't work until the first physics frame. So you could set frame equals 0, and in process, if frame equals 1, then run the deal damage, and add one to frame at the end. So now the player takes damage, and if there's other mines in range, it sets off a chain reaction. But I think it's better to use shape casting here instead. So I'll get rid of the process function and the frame variable, then make a new physics 2D shape query parameters, and set the shape to the collision shape 2D dot shape, and set the transform query.transform equals global transform. Then we'll get the result of get world 2D direct space state dot intersect shape and pass the query. And for R in result, use the connector to deal damage from self to the result collider and pass the damage amount. So now when I play the project, the damage AoE works, but it throws a stack overflow. So in my capped value class, which I'm using for the health resource, I check if the amount reached 0 and emit the signal before I set the current, so it's emitting the signal and then re-triggering the explosion. So I'll make a new variable for the previous value, then set the current, and if previous is greater than 0 and current is less than or equal to 0, then emit the current 0 signal. And in the dimension, I'll re-enable the sharks. So now the bombs deal damage to the player and the enemies. As you can see, you can use your laser to trigger them. And lastly, I want to add a knockback effect to the explosion. So on the area, I'll set space override to replace combine, enable the gravity point, and set the gravity vector to 0 so it's centered. Then I'll turn the gravity all the way down and set the linear and angular damp to 0. So now when you collide with the mines, it launches the player back. That's all for this episode of Derp Star. Thank you for watching and have a great day.